hours after Yusuf Habibie addressed the nation. As we reported earlier, thousands of Indonesian students occupying parliament for the fifth straight day demanded Habibie step down. The students say they won't leave the parliament until Habibie follows Suharto. The students are also demanding that the former dictator Suharto be put on trial. Meanwhile, supporters of Habibie stormed into the parliament and attacked some of the pro-democracy students. Reuters reports that rocks and bottles were thrown before a debate ensues. Well, right now we are joined by Professor Noam Chomsky from Boston. Professor Chomsky, a professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, world-renowned political analyst. In fact, I think it's fair to say that he has kept the issue of Indonesia alive more than any other person in this country, letting us know about this dictator Suharto and his 32-year brutal reign, not to mention the 22-year illegal occupation of East Timor, which was resulted in a third of the population being killed. That's 200,000 people. In fact, it was Professor Chomsky's writings that alerted me to what was going on in East Timor and led to my going there in 1990, returning in 1991, where I witnessed the massacre of more than 250 Timorese, and returning again in 94, where I was once again banned and barred by a military, this one, the Indonesian military. But I want to thank you for that, Professor Chomsky, and welcome you to Democracy Now!
Very glad to be with you, Amy.
Well, what is your response to this historic, maybe it's a change, maybe it's not in Indonesia, but where the dictator Suharto has been forced out?
Well, it's whatever the outcome, and the outcome is highly unclear and could be pretty grim. It is undoubtedly a historic achievement. I mean, there was a popular movement with no resources succeeded in at least formally overthrowing, we don't know if it's more than that, but at least formally overthrowing one of the most brutal figures of the 20th century, and in a relatively peaceful manner. There have been plenty of people killed, but by the standards of overthrow of dictators, it's pretty small. Whether this will lead to real changes in Indonesia, that's hard to say, and I don't think that the participants would even have an idea what they're going to do. The main participants who matter are the military, who've been the effective power in the country for a long time, certainly ever since the mass slaughters of the mid-1960s, which accompanied Suharto's rise to power, which wiped out their main opposition, the main political parties, and in fact were aimed at them. So they remain in control, and where they undoubtedly have splits within them. The replacement for Suharto, Habibie, is a crony, basically. He has no, as everyone correctly points out, he has no base of support or power other than what comes from Suharto and the military, as long as the military stays behind him. And it seems unlikely that he can hang on very long unless there's a brutal military repression. So I think there will be considerable turmoil and conflict before this situation resolves. You can imagine a very favorable evolution towards dismantling not only the tyrannical political system, but also the extraordinarily corrupt and vicious economic system. I mean, one Australian specialist on Indonesia really recently described Indonesia as a Stalinist state on top of Dodge City, basically a family-owned monopoly, a very rich country. There's a lot of talk about its economic development under Suharto. That's not totally false, but one has to be rather skeptical about a lot of the figures because, as the economic modelers themselves have pointed out, many of them Australians, they were forced to give those figures. They knew they weren't true. And what exactly has happened, what exactly the economy is somewhat of a mystery. I mean, it's based on huge private take just say the debt, estimated at roughly $80 billion. According to Indonesian economists, that debt is held by maybe 50 people, maybe 200 on the outside. The other 200 million Indonesians are the ones who are paying the costs.
There
They didn't borrow the money.
are estimates that Suharto has somewhere between 40 and 50 billion dollars, his personal wealth.
Yeah, and of course that's plus or minus a bit because who knows. But yeah, those are the normal figures. Actually, the CIA gives similar figures, and that's roughly notice that it's in the same range as the IMF bailout package, which tells you something pretty simple, that there's a very easy way to overcome that component of the debt, namely simply get the people who borrowed the money and robbed the country to pay off what they borrowed. I mean, the 200 million Indonesians didn't borrow the money. It shouldn't be their debt. The reason why they should starve because somebody else borrowed billions of dollars and now has them to pay for it. Ask them to pay for it and ask us to pay for it. That's the standard technique. The people who borrow and the banks and investors who made the bad loans are not expected to pay the costs. The costs fall primarily on the victims, that's the 200 million people in Indonesia, and on Western taxpayers who are to provide the bailout funds. That's what's called capitalism.
Professor Noam Chomsky, why have you been so interested in Indonesia over this 32-year reign of Suharto?
Well, I got interested too late, as usual. I did, of course, get interested in the mid-'60s. There was the worst slaughter since the Holocaust took place in Indonesia. It was praised with utter euphoria in the West. I have to give the press credit. It did not conceal what was happening. So New York Times described it as a staggering bloodbath. Time magazine had a big cover story, 11 pages on the boiling bloodbath in which, hundreds of thousands of people were being murdered, mostly landless peasants, and destroyed the one mass-based political party in the country. And this was greeted with joy and applause, which was totally unrestrained. I mean, it was a remarkable moment just to watch it. It was astonishing. I can't remember anything similar before or after. And it was pretty hard not to pay attention at that point. There was the question then of what exactly the level of U.S. involvement was. It's become, even today, a lot of this is being kept secret. So, for example, probably the major U.S. subversive action after the Second World War was undertaken in Indonesia in 1958 in an effort to separate the outer islands, the ones that have most of the resources, the oil, so that they'd remain part of the West, even if the inner islands remained nationalist under Suharto. The story of that has been dug out by researchers, primarily by Audrey and George Cahan at Cornell. George Cahan is the founder of Southeast Asian Studies, very distinguished scholar, and they has worked on Indonesia for years. And they discovered a great deal about what happened, and the scale of that intervention, that effort to create a civil war which would tear out the outer islands, was remarkable. But it is, even in the declassified record, it's not reported. So lots is being kept secret. Hence, it was very hard to find out exactly what has happened, and remains hard. But enough is known to know that it was, a huge and monstrous slaughter orchestrated by the army. The massacres were army-led. That means Suharto's army, certainly backed by the United States strongly and applauded by the U.S. intellectual community, the media across the board. It was presented, even by American liberals at the time, as a proof that we were doing the right thing in Vietnam, on the grounds that by sort of holding the line in Vietnam, we had encouraged the Indonesian generals to carry out this noble task of cleansing their society. After this display, it was difficult not to pay attention. And U.S. planners understood the importance. Years later, George Bundy, who was then National Security Advisor, pointed out, more or less plausibly, that it would have made sense, from their point of view, to pull out of Vietnam right after the Indonesian slaughter, because by that time Indochina had been sufficiently devastated so that it wasn't going to be any kind of a model for others to follow. And the region was being insulated so that any effect of what they called the virus of independent development would be blocked. Especially Indonesia was most important.
Professor Chomsky, in 1965, we know about Suharto's rise to power, the slaughter of more than 500,000 Indonesians as he rose to power and took power from Sukarno, the founding president of Indonesia. And then 10 years later, in 1975, an issue that you have continually written about and spoken about, Indonesia's illegal invasion of East Timor, which they illegally occupy to this day, with a third of the population killed. What about the U.S. role and support of Indonesia in its occupation of East Timor?
Well, that's not even a question. The U.S. was providing 90% of the arms at the time under a treaty which required Indonesia to use them only for self-defense. So any use of American arms was illegal. The U.S. knew in advance, effectively authorized the invasion. We know that from leaked Australian diplomatic cables. Right after the invasion, the United Nations Security Council ordered the Indonesians out, and the United States actually voted for that. But later, well, as you know, Ambassador Moynihan, Senator, in his memoirs, described with great pride how he had rendered, at the orders of the State Department, he had rendered the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it might do to terminate the occupation and the slaughter. He knew that there was a slaughter and reported it. Right after that, the U.S. Secretly stepped up shipments of arms to Indonesia while denying it. That was exposed by Ben Anderson, another Cornell University scholar.
Professor Chomsky, I wanted to interrupt because we just got this report from Reuters that says the Indonesian Army's most decorated soldier, who has a reputation for a firm grasp of international affairs, took charge of the country's information ministry today. Lieutenant General Yunus Yosfaya stood silently near President Yusuf Habibie when he announced the veteran would take over the post held mostly by civilians for the past 15 years. But Yosfaya is sure to attract some international controversy, especially in Australia, for his command of the Special Forces Unit blamed for the deaths of the 5 Australia-based journalists in Timor in October of 1975. An Australian government report on the killings quoted witnesses as saying Captain Yunus was in charge of the unit responsible. Yosfaya has always refused to comment. This, the killing of the 5 journalists in 1975 as the Indonesian military was moving into East Timor. It's a story I know very well. The documentary we did, we broadcast the last report of Greg Shackleton of ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, where he said to the world, because everyone heard this report, the Timorese are appealing for help. They're asking if they should turn to the United Nations. We are reporting from a city, or we are reporting from a town we will never forget in occupied Timor, Greg Shackleton. And it was a report no one would forget because he and his colleagues were executed the next day. I did a documentary on Timor and got a letter from Shackleton's wife. And she said that I got the execution right, but I didn't quite get the details of it right. I had said that they were all just shot in the head. She said that her husband died because the Indonesian military, headed by this man Yunus, who's just been appointed now, we understand, to be head of the information ministry, that these reporters had their genitals cut off, stuffed in their mouths, and they suffocated to death as they were killed. This, the latest news out of Indonesia now, the man in charge of that execution and that brutality has just been named head of the information ministry of Indonesia.
Well, that's the kind of step that unfortunately could be anticipated. It looks as if no change has taken place other than names. Suharto is standing right behind Habibie, who has no other base of support, and this is very bad news, indicating that they're putting in, even though they certainly must have understood that this would be extremely offensive, even to the Australian government, which is bent over backwards to support Indonesia. Nevertheless, they're proceeding. Should be mentioned, and I'm sure you've said this in the past, that Timor has a kind of a special meaning to Australians. During the Second World War, Australia invaded East Timor. That brought the Japanese in. They might well have left Portuguese East Timor alone otherwise. The Australians left a couple hundred commandos there to try. This was an effort to try to prevent the Japanese from invading Australia, and the commandos kept fighting. And in the course of that, they were protected by the Timorese, and about 60,000 Timorese were killed as a result of the Australian invasion and in protection of the Australian commandos. So there's, when Australia now supports the Indonesian atrocities and recognizes the occupation and steals Timor's oil, that raises lots of antagonism among ordinary Australians, as you can imagine.
I'm reading further in this report, and it says the man who's just been made the press minister of Indonesia, this man who has long ties to East Timor, that unofficial biography is published abroad, allege he killed Nicolau Lobato, then leader of the East Timorese resistance, while up there in Timor, and that he has a chest full of medals, and unlike some other generals, he got them from being, quote, in harm's way, and in Indonesia, that probably means in East Timor.
Right. Well, that's a sign that the military is willing to take rather brazen steps towards asserting authority.
Professor Chomsky, we just have a minute, and I wanted to bring this back to the United States. President Clinton has said that they applaud a democratic transition and encourage Indonesian leaders in that democratic transition. And yet at the same time, we see that the U.S. military has continued to support the Indonesian military. The Nation magazine is just putting out a report today that says that the U.S.-trained special units in Indonesia are responsible for the latest set of disappearances of activists. And the Nation put out just a month ago in a report by Alan Nairn that the Indonesian soldiers, the most brutal ones, the Kopassus forces, are trained by Green Berets right through to May 1st.
Well, the United States has very definitely had close contacts with the Indonesian military going back to the 1950s. That was part of the subversion that I mentioned, and was surely involved in the 1960s atrocities, and continues to have. In fact, McNamara pointed out that he praised the training of Indonesian military officers in the United States in U.S. universities as having given them, the right understanding, which enabled them to carry out their work and so on and so forth. And that just continues up till today. The Pentagon regards Indonesia as a very significant ally, the Indonesian military. It's strategically important. Aside from its enormous wealth resources, it happens to be strategically important. A huge amount of, in fact, the majority of the international commerce passes right next to it. It's got deep water passage for nuclear submarines and so on. And it's the most powerful country in the region. So sure, they're tied in with it very tightly. And when Clinton talks about a democratic transition, we have to remember that we're listening to a broken record. Every time a favorite dictator loses control, the United States applauds the loss of control by its old friend and tries to ease him out and put in something equivalent. This happened recently with Duvalier. It happened with Marcos. It happened with Somoza.
On that note,
with Shah. This is just like a broken record.
Professor Chomsky, I want to thank you very much for being there with us for all of these years. Professor Noam Chomsky, linguist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, well-known political analyst. Thanks for being there.